Welcome to the first of two video lessons on intellectual development and on the theories of intellectual development. We're going to talk about those theories first before we talk about what teaching applications can come out of those theories. Now, if you look on the board over here, you'll see that there are at least 4 general approaches to actually making some good sense out of how it is that we learn. These theories have to do with describing the ways we think and the ways we learn, given that the ways we think. So, one tradition, the first one we're going to talk about today, is the cognitive developmental research tradition. And researchers in this area start with a particular question. How do we make sense out of things? In other words, this tradition wonders how we actually interact with the world and create the kind of world that we carry around with us. Okay? If the term constructivism rings a bell, you'll see that that's one of the teaching applications that comes out of this tradition. Behavioral research looks at thinking and learning from the point of view of what can be done by people or to people in order to bring about the changes that we call learning. And we'll look at pure behaviors kinds of views, and also modified versions of it. The third tradition of research is information processing. And they start with this, a slightly different question. They look at mechanics. How do the things that we call thinking and learning actually function? What are the mechanisms of them? And finally, there's the psychometric research tradition that starts with the question, what is intelligence? How do we recognize it? How do we measure it? In what ways can it be manipulated? So, the subject of this video and the next one will be that first tradition, that of cognitive developmental research. The instigator of that research, and probably still its best known representative, was a Swiss national by the name of Jean Piaget. And I am going to put up a picture of Mr. Piaget. That's a little bit glary. Let's see if I can make it a little better. That's a little better. Here's Piaget as an older gentleman. I'm beginning to get that crazy white hair myself, so I know exactly how he feels. Piaget started with a question about how individual children actually come to see and make sense out of the world around them. He used a technique of research that the text describes as a clinical research and a case study kind of approach to finding out what it is we want to find out, to doing empirical studies. And he was a master of that clinical approach. He invented lots and lots of tests and simulations and lots of good questions to work with individual children of many ages to find out how they made sense of the world. We're going to review his findings in this video. First, some key concepts. When Piaget summarized his findings, what he noticed was that we change the ways that we make sense out of the world, given the sensory input and the information that comes to us. And we change it and grow in our ability to make sense out of the world through a couple of related processes. One of them he called assimilation. And what he means by assimilation is the gradual building up of a concept from input and information that comes to us as we move through the world. So that what starts out as a simple concept gets built upon, gets extended, and so that new information that comes our way can be made a part of that concept, okay, and make it more complex and more elaborate, so that we understand new information in terms of what we already know and make sense out of. But Piaget recognized that some learning disrupts established concepts and ways of making sense. And when that occurs, when something totally new comes up that doesn't fit with what we already think we know and how to make sense of the world, then we have to accommodate it. We have to form a new concept, or we have to radically alter an old one. We move back and forth between assimilating learning and accommodating learning in such a way that at any given time we're comfortable that we do make sense out of our world. And that process of being comfortable in the idea that we've made sense out of the world, he called equilibration. So that all learning, no matter how disruptive, moves us in some ways toward what we want, equilibration. There's one more key concept that Piaget invented. His notion of those concepts, the many of them that we have, by which we make sense of the world, he called schema. We could call them schemes today. In other words, a way of constructing, describing, reasoning from a conception of how things are. So we'll talk about schema at some length during this and the next photo session. Let's start off with some basics about what Piaget thought he had found about the way we develop into fully functioning human beings who can make sense of the world on our own in successful ways. This first approach has become today kind of, a little bit disparagingly, called the ages and stages model of intellectual development. Piaget believed that he had evidence from his clinical studies, piling up one on top of the other, that we go through a number of discrete stages by which we make sense out of the world. And these stages are identifiable by the intellectual tools that we prefer and use most effectively in making sense of the world. He believed that there were only 4 such stages. The first, the sensory motor stage of making sense out of the world, he thought extended from birth through about 2 years of age. The second, the pre-operational stage, he believed from toddlerhood through the very first school years, from about 2 to 7. The concrete operational stage, the rest of our regular school, grade school years, till about age 11. And then finally, the formal operational stage of making sense of the world, he believed began in early adolescence and continued through adulthood. So some of the features of these zoom a little bit. There we go. Some of the features of these ages and stages model are these. Piaget noted that we're born able to learn. We learn through our reflexes that are part of the equipment that we actually come with as a newborn. We learn through our ability to habituate, that is to say, to get used to input and sensory phenomena to the point that we don't pay all that much attention to them, we take them for granted. We are able to perceive. We have the use of, after a few weeks, of almost all of the senses that we're able to make use of throughout our lives, and we physically manipulate our world. I once gave a little demonstration with my students. I had students close their eyes, and I handed them some keys. And I said, what are these? No one ever has any trouble identifying them as keys. But the key question is, so to speak, how do you know that these are keys? And the answer almost always is, well, I know the sound of them clinking because I've heard that sound many times before. I know the feel of a key because I've felt them many times before. I know their shape. I know their hardness. We continue to learn in sensory motor ways all of our lives. What changes are the intellectual tools that we gradually develop through maturation, through that genetic process, that enable us to learn in other ways and with other intellectual tools as well, so that we become more enamored of these new tools and gradually use them more often. The second stage he called the pre-operational stage. At around the age of 2, Piaget noticed that children began to treat the world in a way that he called symbolic. Very gradually, they learned to pretend. First, for instance, by pretending that something that they're going to use is there when it really isn't. So, pretending to take a drink when there isn't any cup. And gradually progressing into what becomes social play later on. For instance, the old tea party episode where kids will sit down and pretend they're having a tea party with all of what they conceive to be the adult interactions, pretending to drink things that aren't there, using the things on the tea table symbolically. When you begin to see 2- and 3-year-olds pick up a stick and pretend it's a horse and ride it, you're beginning to see that they're treating the world symbolically. And one of the key features of this ability to look at the world symbolically, besides fantasy, is language. Later on we're going to see that Vygotsky believed that language was the key to learning overall. But for Piaget, the recognition by young kids that the sounds that they utter are not just sensory motor things, so that when a 9-year-old babbling, a 9-month-old babbling may say something like ba 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 ma mama, and all the adults think that they're talking about mama. What they're really doing is recognizing a schema that if they make these sounds, then certain things happen, like people fuss over them and pick them up and give them food and things like that. When that turns into recognizing that the sounds that they're making actually stand for something else, then language takes off. And we'll talk separately about language development in this course later on. The third stage is concrete operational thinking. In concrete operational thinking, what it is that pre-operational thinkers can do evolves very gradually into more complex kind of deliberate operations that we make on the world around us to make a kind of sense of what's in the world. One of the key operations that school-age kids get better at is classification and all of its relations. The ability to sequence, the ability to recognize or form a hierarchy, the ability to put things into increasingly complex categories. All of those things help us to organize the world and to make sense out of the world. Piaget believed that there is a rather sudden switching from pre-operational thinking to the beginnings of concrete operations around the age of 7. And we'll talk in a moment about what evidence he had for that. Not only can concrete operational thinkers do classification increasingly well, but they also get better at making what you might call inductive inferences. In other words, deliberately using logic in ways that enable them, for instance, to generalize about things on the basis of individual occurrences adding up. Right? In other words, to be able to go from what they see in front of them on one occasion or another occasion to being able to generalize about what happens overall. That kind of logic, inductive inference, is something that Piaget saw develops gradually until it reaches a pretty high ability at the end of the concrete operational thinking period. Now, Piaget believed there was only one more stage of intellectual development in our ability to make sense of the world, what he called formal operational thinking. He believed kids matured into around the beginning to the middle of their adolescence. And during this period of time, Piaget saw that kids got a lot better at a number of intellectual tools used to make sense of things that we as adults prefer and make use of greatly. For one thing, abstraction. For him, abstraction is, linguistically, is the ability to use and make sense out of terms that describe the world in ways other than what we sense directly. And we'll talk about abstraction and how that helps us to make sense of the world in the next lesson. Also, that kids get better at what-ifs. In other words, if you were able to say, you know, suppose history had been different, what would have changed? Or what if, in the future, something like X occurs? What would then happen as a result? Connected to that is, let me sort of skip down, is deductive inference. The increasing ability of teenagers and adults to reason in a slightly different way than what we called inductive inference. In other words, to be able to say, suppose that X is true, what would have to follow? Connected to this ability to imagine possible worlds is that ability to do deductive inference. Metacognitive skills increase. In other words, the ability to think about one's own thinking for adolescents and adults becomes gradually something that they do better and better. The ability to think systematically rather than randomly becomes more a factor during these years as well. In other words, to follow a line of reasoning completely from beginning to end, exploring all the possibilities and not just grasping onto the first that occurs. That's something that Piaget saw adolescents getting better at. And finally, introspection, self-consciousness, more of an ability to examine one's own thinking, to examine one's own feelings, to focus on how we ourselves actually operate in the world and make sense of the world. That kind of thinking about thinking and feeling about feeling is something that Piaget found that adolescents do an awful lot better. For Piaget, this happened in terms of stages. Let me put that other illustration back up. So what is a stage, if not a kind of a box, right? One that encloses and not only includes things, but also excludes what's outside of it. Piaget thought that the transitions among and between these ways of preferring intellectual tools to make sense of the world more or less represented boxes. Now, within each of these, he tracked substages where we gradually develop from the beginnings to the ends that lead us into the next stage. But he still thought of these as stages. And later researchers have pretty much rejected this notion. For one thing, what they found was that, for instance, the beginnings of concrete operations, the ability to classify in rudimentary ways, begins a lot earlier than Piaget seemed to think. At the beginning of pre-operational thinking, a lot of kids can classify in very rudimentary ways. Piaget didn't notice it, and he wasn't looking for it after a while. But later researchers found that. Formal operations. What later researchers found is that people develop in a rudimentary way most of the skills and ways of looking at the world around them before that age of 12 or whatever that Piaget thought represented kids moving into a new box. And maybe most interestingly of all, Piaget may have both overestimated and underestimated adults. Because researchers lately have discovered that later on in life, many people do develop abilities for looking at and making sense out of the world that Piaget didn't talk about, didn't see in his own research. But also, researchers have discovered that in many parts of our intellectual life, we don't act like formal operational thinkers. That people can, in fact, apply some of the tools of making sense of the world to doing formal operational thinking, but in other aspects of their intellectual life, focus on concrete and prefer those. There are very few people, later researchers have found, who are purely formal operational thinkers. So this introduction, then, to the cognitive developmental way of looking at how kids and adults learn is one that I hope you will also coordinate with what it is that you read in the book. What I would like you to do in answering a few questions that you'll turn in online, and I'll put these up on Moodle as well, is first of all, in making sure that you understand what the cognitive developmental research tradition represents and how that tradition takes off from a fundamental question. I want you to make sure that you fully understand what distinguishes one stage in Piaget's account from another stage. See if you can look for the key elements that accomplish that. Secondly, I'd like you to think a little bit and maybe answer a few questions on how can we best teach to children who we recognize are primarily operating at one or another of these stages. Those are questions to think about formally and to offer some answers to on Moodle. Okay, that's it for video 1. Next stop, video 2.